Okay, in this class we've already read several Renga or linked verse sequences of both the Hyakuin Renga variety and also the Kasen variety. And as a supplementary reading, I have assigned this article by Horton called Renga Unbound. And in his article, he includes two translations in the appendices of rules for Renga. Okay, and the first one is called Renga kaiseki shiki, rules for Renga sessions, written by the Kanto warrior poet Nitta Shojun in the late 15th century, I think. I'll put the dates and the information below about the author and the time of composition of the work. But in this video I'm going to read these two translations aloud, starting with Renga kaiseki shiki. And again, the link to Horton's article is in the description below. Appendix 1, it's in his appendix. Rules for linked verse sessions. Renga kaiseki shiki. Rule 1. The day before you take part in a linked verse session, put your public and private affairs in order the day before. Next, cleanse yourself and see to your appearance. Then consider the nature of the next day's session and determine the ranks of those scheduled to attend in order that you make no mistakes. Put linked verse composition before all else. If you have extra time and energy, consult writings on the subject. Okay, so there's obviously much preparation that has to go is involved in these linked verse composition settings. Rule number 2. The morning of the session, chant Chinese and Japanese poems. Savor them and elevate and purify your mind as though entering a state of meditation. Okay. So you have to prepare by chanting canonical Chinese and Japanese poems so that these are on the tip of your tongue when you participate in the session. Number 3. When you take your place at a session, avoid odd stories and such, since they will give rise to laughter on recollection and unsettle the mind. Moreover, if there is a hiatus between verses during the first round, it is unpleasant to hear chit-chat, whispering to one's neighbors, and shouting for servants. In addition, it is disruptive to see people reading or writing. Nor should the host constantly scold people. Okay, so one has to be focused. The focus has to be on the composition and not on chit-chat or any other superfluous matters. Rule number 4. It is acceptable to linger over the waki. Alright, waki is the second stanza in the sequence, you'll remember. It is acceptable to linger over the waki and the daisan, which is the third, verses, but tedious to spend too much time on them. From the fourth verse onward, composition should proceed quickly and involve nothing that sounds unusual. So you remember that the fourth verse, until the penultimate verse, these verses are all called the hiraku. Okay, they should proceed quickly and involve nothing that sounds unusual. When the second verse round starts, the person who made the waki, second verse, should compose the first verse, and the one who did the hokku, the second. Okay, so whoever did the hokku in the first round does the second in the next round. Those who made the daisan and subsequent verses may then compose quickly, in any order. The poets who made the waki and daisan should compose particularly quickly in the second round. When the third round arrives, more thought can be given to the verses, and it is enjoyable if something interesting develops. When the back of the final page is reached, those who have only composed 3 to 5 verses or so in the sequence should abstain. But if the guests of honor have all composed verses, then beginners may make some. For votive or congratulatory sequences, the verses on the last side must not be melancholy or unfelicitous. Rule number 5. It does not do to recite one's verse in a manner unintelligible to the scribe. Okay, so remember the scribe is there present at the setting, and the scribe is the one who listens to the poets recite the verse or the stanza and then writes them down, right? Keeping in mind all the rules, reminding the poets of whatever rules that they forget at that moment as they're focusing on the poems and so forth. The scribe. It does not do to recite one's verse in a manner unintelligible to the scribe. So make it clear to the scribe so that he's able to transcribe it precisely and accurately. Nor should one recite it in too loud a voice, fail to wait for the scribe to be ready, or be insensitive to the most elevated in attendance. Okay? So this is very much a performative art. You have to be aware of everybody who's involved, and you have to make your recitation clear to the scribe so that they can write it down. One should pick up one's fan and recite one's verse with clarity and composure. And it is very rude to look smug after giving one's verse or to show disapproval after hearing another's. Well-bred people do not act clever or superior. Alright, so you can't be... Okay, so one must behave with humility. Number 6. It is very unpleasant to see someone taking umbrage if his verse is refused or smirking at another's mistakes. One should be gentle and patient, make no distinctions between oneself and others, and compose with deep feeling. Alright? So this is a collaborative art form, right? So the emphasis is not on the individual poet or the individual poem, it's on the whole, right? So one shouldn't make distinctions between oneself and others. It's a single unit that is composing this sequence of verses. And compose with deep feeling, right? Deep feeling, I think here is a translation of the word ushing, if I'm not mistaken, which we've discussed in other videos and study guides. There will be times when a person of rank will have his verse rejected for this or that reason, and there will be cases when a person who has already given a number of mediocre verses will have his next attempt sent back. It depends not only on the rules but on the moment. One must always defer to the scribe. It does not do to turn to neighbors and question infractions, much less to take the recording paper and examine it. Nor should one express dissent when the scribe has chosen to be lenient and overlook an infraction. And one should not alter a verse with no infractions after it has been entered on the recording paper. When a young person commits an infraction, one should not take it as a chance to immediately offer a verse oneself. Rather, one should first ask him if he wishes to change it. And infractions, as Horton discusses in the article and as we've discussed in previous video lectures and the study guide, infraction is when you break the shikimoku, right? The shikimoku are the complex set of rules regarding where the hana no joza or the tsuki no joza must appear, how much distance should be between koi or love stanzas, for example, and so forth. There's so many rules that poets would often forget the various rules and break a rule, in which case the scribe would remind them of the rules and then give them a chance to amend the rules, right? All right, number 7. Rule number 7. Do not gawk at the water and rocks in the garden or at the pictures on walls and standing screens. But do not stare at the faces of the others either. It is also uncouth to noisily open a neighbor's fan and examine it. Alright, so notice that many of these rules here are not about the poetic composition per se, but about the rules and decorum and the social conventions that must accompany the poetry set, the session. Number 8. It is unpleasant to see someone who, while thinking, glances from side to side, twists about, leans over, or puts his fan to his face. When you are working on a verse, do not let the others see. It is not particularly good to lean a bit forward while thinking. Okay, so don't make a display of the fact that you're thinking and composing a verse at that moment. Do it subtly and quietly, right? Rule number 9. It is rude to endlessly finger one's rosary, the Buddhist rosary that you hold in your hands, or loudly intone sutras at a session. The way of poetry conforms with the Buddhist truth of ultimate reality, and it is in accord as well with the principles of inner enlightenment through the compassionate vow of another. Okay, so this Buddhist element enters the picture here. As we've discussed in other videos, Renga is a very Buddhist art form, right? As we've discussed. One ought therefore to compose frequently on the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But on a day when one is to participate in linked verse, one should meditate, and refrain from even good works, not to mention wrongdoing. All those who would enter into the virtuous way of linked verse must not waste time in worthless acts, kill birds and animals, do violence to grasses and trees, play the game Go, backgammon, or pranks, or spend their days emulating Zaiwo. And there's a note about Zaiwo there. One must be constantly aware of the evanescence of all life, right, the Mujo that we've discussed in other videos. And you remember that Barnhill, I think, makes the argument that Renga, the art form of Renga, its fundamental purpose is to make one aware of the fundamental Buddhist truths, right? The truth of the impermanence or the evanescence of all life, namely. Right? So you must be constantly aware of this evanescence of all life as you're composing and in the preparation to the composition session. Observe the changes of the season, right? As we've talked about, Kigo, or seasonal words, is fundamental to Renga. So you must observe the change of the season, be moved by the snow, the moon, the blossoms, right? 3 important images. The Tsuki no Joza, Hana no Joza. Revere the Buddhas and the gods, the Shinto gods. Keep benevolence and compassion in the heart, right? So the 2 Confucian virtues of Ren and Ren. Respect parents and elder siblings. Value ritual and keep to the right path. For then one will be in accord with the will of the deities, find happiness, and gain honor and fame. He who possesses a cultivated exterior but a disordered heart will find that his words, no matter how golden, are useless. So it's worth noting that one shouldn't come into the Renga session just with a Buddhist frame of mind. You must also have a Shinto frame of mind, a sort of awareness of the Shinto gods in mind as you're composing, and also an awareness of Confucian social virtues, right? Rule number 10. It is disgusting when someone starts fanning himself ostentatiously, or loudly blows his nose, or spits right and left, or pulls open his collar and exposes his chest, or rolls up his sleeves, or lets his shins show, or wiggles his toes, or props his head up in his hands, or leans against something, or strokes his beard, or waves his fan about, or wipes his eyes and nose with his fingers, or fidgets with his hands. And I should have mentioned at the beginning here, as Horton mentions at the beginning of this essay, or in his essay, Renga, the art form of Renga, was the most popular literary genre of the medieval period, right? So it expands outward from the capital, from the city, from the metropolis, into the provinces, and as it does spread in popularity, you have all kinds of classes and farmers and peasants and so forth start participating in the genre, right? So So one of the purposes of writing these rule books is to sort of guide the lower class people, poets and the peasants and so forth, so that they don't break the rules of propriety and behave in a vulgar way. Rule number 11. The session should begin at dawn at the latest and should end as dusk deepens. In the provinces, though, people spend the morning babbling about trivialities, begin composition when the sun is high, and hurry to go home before it begins to grow dark. Who, no matter how skilled, could manage under such circumstances? Then there are those who have previous engagements and finally do arrive, but in a desultory way. If you agree to participate, you should not relinquish your turn, but do your share. Even a beginner should produce a verse. It is written in a book on military strategy that no one man makes an army. The army makes an army. Those at a linked verse session should feel this way as well. Okay, so I should also mention that the Renga sequences that we read in this class, some of them only have 3 poets, but that is more of an exception than the rule. A lot of times there are a dozen or so poets participating in the session, at times even 30 or so participating in the Hyakuin Renga, so each poet composes only 3 stanzas in the entire sequence, right? So these are guidelines about how to comport oneself during the session. And notice that he encourages the session to go on for the entire day, from dawn all the way into evening, into the night. Rule number 12. If you are at this session with men of rank or with experts, do not attempt fine verses. Instead, you should do your share in a simple manner. Moreover, you should exercise caution when it is the place for the guest of honor to compose. Conflict with the ranking participants will be the worst fault of the day. Always try to avoid it. It is also tedious when one gives the first part of a verse, then waits and ponders the rest. Okay, so in short, no showing off, and competition is anathema to this art form. Rule number 13. When you join a session already underway, move to your place on your hands and knees, then seat yourself sedately, without disturbing the dress or fans of those about you. Let all your actions be graceful and considerate. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Number 14. It is despicable to wear one's formal cap at an angle, to let one's hair be unkempt, to have one's robe twisted at the waist or seams askew or coming apart, or to draw one's sword. Okay? And, of course, only the bushi, the samurai, have swords. So this rule wouldn't apply to non-bushi members of the session. And it is disgraceful for a priest to let his hair grow down, his beard grow unshaven, as mine is right now, his ears and nose become hairy, you should trim your ears, or his fingernails and toenails grow long and filthy. Nor should he wear his monk's cap or stole inside the room. Those who are ill or elderly should not participate save with consent of the group. Number 15. One should avoid difficult verses, names of distant places, Chinese words, and vulgarity. Okay, so this is a very important rule in the context of Ushin Renga. In later haikai Renga, which we've already discussed, this rule will not be relevant, right? Because Chinese words are kango, and difficult verses, and names of distant places in China and so forth, and common or vulgar elements, all will be allowed in later haikai Renga, but we're still in the world of classical linked verse here, and these are prohibited. Number 16. When you take your place at a session, or if you arrive late, do not dawdle or draw out your greetings. Follow the indications of the ranking person or elder present. With the wine cup as well, be brief when the situation warrants. Rule number 17. Loudly reciting one's own verse or loudly praising another's verse is unpleasant to hear. No matter how much one is taken by a verse, one's praise should be thoughtful and quiet. Nor should one recite the verse in too soft a voice. Right? It has to be audible to the scribe and to the other poets, because they will be writing the shikiku, or the next verse. And it is disagreeable always to be repeating one's own verses to the people nearby. If one refuses to mix with the others, or if someone nods off, the atmosphere of the session will be dampened. Okay, so you can't fall asleep, which is something that happens a lot in Japanese universities, for example. You see professors, when I was graduate student at Waseda, for example, our professor would often fall asleep in the middle of a seminar. That is frowned upon in Renga sessions. Number 18. One should not keep getting up at a session. It is acceptable to get up once or so to refresh oneself, to rinse out the mouth, and so forth. But one should not leave in the middle, nor should one arrive in the middle. Okay, that is very rude. You have to keep in mind the entire flow or the yukiyo of the entire sequence. And in order to do that, you have to be present and alert through the whole thing. Number 19. It is deplorable to gorge oneself, grow scarlet with intoxication, noisily crunch one's food, or imbibe like a dragon. And it is rude to monopolize the savories and scatter them about. Number 20. At a session before a holy name or image, one should not partake of meat or fish before the 100 verses are completed. For a votive sequence in particular, one should avoid ritual pollution the day before and refrain from sexual congress. Okay, so it's like a NBA basketball player. You should not engage in sexual activity before the big game the next day. These rules do not apply to throwaway verses or sessions composed of beginners. Rule number 21. This is the last rule, I think. At 100 or 1,000 verse sequence, one should sit quietly until the end. It is disconcerting to make noise talking to a neighbor before it is completed. Thereafter, one should make a quiet exit after remarking on how much one enjoyed the session. On the way home and after retiring, one should reflect on the virtues and shortcomings of the verses one composed. And it is disgraceful not to write a thank you note to the host the next day. Okay, that was the last rule, and then the author of the rule book adds the following commentary. These are the teachings of Sōgi Shūenki, Sōgi, Kensai, and others. I have mentioned in addition some of the unseemly things I myself have witnessed lately which are unheard of at sessions of quality in the capital. Thanks to the ever-increasing blessings of the god Sugawara Michizane, sequences of 100 or 1,000 verses now fill storehouses in the barbaric hinterlands where frogs in the well who know nothing of the sea take their places at linked verse sessions, each with consummate disregard for the rest. I have written this for those few of temperance and consideration who have received instruction from me or shown me their verses. They were of course misguided to have done so. It was like admiring a bat on an island where there are no birds. And there's a note there about this bat reference. He's using the proverb akin to the Western proverb that we are familiar with. In the country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, in self-deprecation. Okay, that's the end of the first rule book. The second one that Horton translates here in his essay, in his article, is 10 Vexations of Linked Verse. And I'll provide information about the author and date of composition in the description to this video below. The 10 Vexations of Linked Verse, or in the original, Renga Jumuyaku. Rule number 1, or vexation number 1. It is vexing when someone fails to study in private and then squirms in agony when the session begins. Vexation number 2. It is vexing when someone other than the Renga master or the scribe criticizes the verses of poets at the session. Vexation number 3. It is vexing when someone resubmits someone else's verse returned earlier for infractions on the moon, blossoms, etc. Vexation number 4. It is vexing when everyone is at a loss for a good verse and someone submits a hurried one. Vexation number 5. It is vexing when someone keeps asking questions of the scribe and never presents his own verse. Vexation number 6. It is vexing when someone fidgets, waves his fan about, or raps on the floor beside himself in his effort to compose a link. Vexation number 7. It is vexing when someone gives the first 5 syllables of a verse, thereby blocking out the other poets, and then dawdles with the rest. Vexation number 8. It is vexing when someone at a session must ask for help in the first round, and then cannot produce a single verse thereafter. Vexation number 9. It is vexing when a session is not completed by dark and someone calls for a lamp. Vexation number 10. It is vexing when one has distaste for linked verse, for our land came into being out of this poetic way. Which here is a reference to the question and answer courtship of the gods Izanagi and Izanami, out of whose union the Japanese islands were believed to have been formed, as Horton notes in the footnote there. Alright. And I should note that the second rulebook, the Renga Jumuyaku, or 10 Vexations of Linked Verse, is attributed to the great Renga master Sōchō, whose Hyakuin Renga sequence we've already read in a previous class. And again, I'll provide information about him in the description below. Alright, that's the end of the rulebook. Make sure you read the Horton article in full and consider all of his points as we read the other Renga works. Goodbye.